Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Pei Gimel. It's the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started from the bottom of Pei Bet Amud Bet. We're in the middle of a slew of questions of Rava that we didn't have answers to, and each one was premised on the previous one. So now we're up to if you assume that the we're talking about bringing the blood into the Heichal, into the sanctuary, which isn't supposed to be there. And then we talked about bringing in the and the seir, the blood of there. What if after you're already in the Kodesh HaKodashim and you leave and then you bring it back in? Does that disqualify the blood? And then we're going to start with the bottom of Pei Bet Amud Bet, which says the very last two lines, Im tim tzalom hu'il unafak nafal. If we say, look, you already left the Kodesh HaKodashim, if you bring it back in, it's disqualified. What about the following case? Hidami daman ala parochet. What if after you did the sprinkling of the blood on the parochet, which is the divider, you're in the hechal, in the sanctuary, and you sprinkle it on the divider, and then hotzi'an lemizbech, and then you take it out from there, and you bring it to the altar. But the altar also in the sanctuary. So you're basically going backwards in the sanctuary, right? Away from the Kodesh HaKodashim. You're already not in the Kodesh HaKodashim. You're in the sanctuary area. And you walk from, again, that boundary between the Kodesh HaKodashim, which is where on the parochet, where you sprinkled the blood. And then you walk back to the altar. V'chnisan. And then you bring them back to the parochet area. Now you're in the same room, but a different area. Ma, do we say, look, you're still in the same room, so there's no disqualification. Odilma Yitzia Krinabe, but it says on the Pasuk, okay, and here Rashi quotes it, you can see it on the first line of Rashi, and then you have to go out to the altar. So you're not actually going out of a room, but you're going out of that space, and you're moving to the altar. So do we say Yitzia Krinabe, right? And it's a Yitzia, you left already. So, since the Torah calls it Yitzia, maybe it's considered as if you left, and if you go back to that other space, that would disqualify it. We don't know. Now, going back to the Mishnah, there was a machloket in the Mishnah, okay, going back to Pei Bet Amud Aleph, between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Eliezer says, Nichnas l'chaper afa pisha lo chiper. Just going into the sanctuary disqualifies it, even if you didn't put the blood on the altar. Rabbi Shimon Omer ad shechaper says it's only disqualified if you actually put the blood in the wrong, right? You bring it into the sanctuary and put it on the altar. So now we're going to have a more elaborate discussion about their machloket. Tanya. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Ne'amal kan lechaper b'kodesh. We're going to see their source in the psukim, and then we're going to see what does each one do with the other one's pasuk, or why doesn't each agree with the other one? Lechaper b'kodesh. So it says v'chol chatat. That's our pasuk. Asher yuva midama lechaper b'kodesh. So it says that you're going to bring from the blood to atone in the kodesh. V'ne'amar lahalan kol adam lo yeh ba'ol mo'eh b'vo'o lechaper b'kodesh. And then it says, when the Kohen Gadol, they're going to have the exact same language, lechaper b'kodesh. When the Kohen Gadol goes into Kodesh Kodashim, no one is allowed to even be in the sanctuary. Okay? When he goes in, lechaper b'kodesh. Now, what does lechaper b'kodesh mean in that second pasuk? When he goes in to do the atonement, but he hasn't yet done it. Everyone has to leave before he even goes into the Kodesh Kodashim. So, mala halam b'shelo kiper, just like there, it's before atonement was provided. Avkan b'shelo kiper, also here it's going to be when you haven't done the atonement yet. Rabbi Shimon Omer, he compares it to a different verse. Ne'amar kan lechaper, v'ne'amar lahalan, ve'et parachat ve'et sir chatat asher uvat amam lechaper. He's not focusing on lechaper b'kodesh, he's focusing on the word lechaper. So it says the parachatat, it says by here, lechaper in our pasuk, and it says by the parachatat and the sir chatat, the two offerings that the Kohen Gadol brings into the Kodesh Kodashim, asher huva et amam lechaper. And then it says, once you bring the blood into Kodesh Kodashim, and then once you put the blood, and here we're talking about in the inner altar, then the continuation of that pasuk is, then you take the animals out to the Beit HaDeshen and you burn them. Now, at what point do you take them out, right? Asher uvad amam lechaper is saying it was already done. So mala halam b'shekipel, just like there, it was already done. Afkan b'shekipel, same thing in our pasuk. So each one has a pasuk, basically comparing our pasuk to some other pasuk. So now the real question is, what's the difference between them? What's their difference? So right, because they each theoretically could have taken the other pasuk. Mar savar danim chutz michutz, ve'in danim chutz mipnim. So Rabbi Eliezer holds, we learn inside from inside. In both our pasuk and in the pasuk about the people have to stay outside when the Kohen Gadol is inside, the outside is talking about outside the sanctuary. So we're going to learn outside from outside, and we're not going to learn outside from inside. The one about lechaper, the second pasuk that Rabbi Shimon brought, was about atoning inside the temple. So, I'm sorry, inside the sanctuary. We're not going to learn outside the sanctuary from inside the sanctuary, right? That the one who has the blood outside the sanctuary is not allowed to bring it inside, and right. So we're not going to learn outside from inside. Now the Gemara is going to say, just 1 second. Right. In other words, we're comparing the blood of the outside with the blood of the inside. That doesn't make any sense. Umar savar dinim behemami behema ve'in dinim behema me'adam. The other opinion is going to say, what? Rabbi Shimon's going to say, why are you proving it from the fact that the people have to wait outside? That's people, and we're talking about animals, right? The blood of the animals. Much better off learning animal from animal, right? Whereas the blood of the dam of the par and the seir is the animal, and we want to learn about our animal of a regular korban brought on the outer altar. So that's why each one prefers their drasha over the other. Now we're back to the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer. So Rabbi Yehuda had said in the Mishnah, that was the next line, that im hichnis shogeg hashem. If you brought it in by accident, then actually it's not disqualified, which would then imply, obviously, which is what the Gemara says, hamizi pasul. If you brought it in intentionally, it would be disqualified. But now the question is, according to Rabbi Yehuda, b'shekiper or b'shalo kiper, is it a case where you got atonement or where you didn't get atonement? In other words, number one, he's limiting when it's going to be forbidden more than anyone else because he's limiting it only if you did it intentionally. The question is he limiting it even more, only b'shekiper, or even if you haven't done atonement for it? So that's the big question. And now I'm a Rabbi Yirmia. Now we're going to have a long, not so long, but it's going to be a little bit till we develop how we're going to get this. What we're going to see is a machloket between Rabbi Yehuda in a different situation. And we're going to know what pasuk he doesn't quote, what side he doesn't take here in his debate with Rabbi Meir. And from there, we're going to assume we could figure out which opinion he holds by. So we'll see as we get there. Amar Rabbi Yirmia, mimashma shenemal ve'et parachatat ve'tzir chatat asher huvat damam lechaper b'kodesh. And when you read that pasuk, this is what we saw before. The parachatat, the tzir chatat, whose blood was brought to atone in the Kodesh. Matamud lamal v'hasoref. Now, what do we do with the next pasuk? The next pasuk says v'hasoref, and the one who burns it, yechabes begadav v'rachatz b'saro b'mayim. So the one who burns these animals becomes impure, that their clothes are impure, and they have to go to the mikvah. So matamud lamar v'hasoref. Why do we have this in the pasuk? So the Gemara stops and says, "What are you talking about? Legufa itzrich. What do you mean? Sorry, I didn't read it twice. So it said matamud lamar v'hasoref, and the Gemara says matamud lamar hasoref. What do you mean? Why does it say hasoref? Legufa itzrich. Of course, you need the pasuk to tell you that the one who burns it, their clothes are impure, they become impure. And you don't need to ask why does it say that. It's totally necessary for its own sake. So now they change it. They say, okay, fine. What they meant to say is, elamata mulamal chatat chatat. Why does it say the par chatat and the seir chatat? You could have said the par v'seir chatat. That's their blood was brought, blah blah blah. So lefishalo amanu ela lepar v'seir shel yom kippurim shenisrafim abeit hadeshem etamim begadim. Says these psukim are basically telling you that they go out, they take, right, that once you do the blood, then you take them out, you burn them, and the one who burns it is going to become impure. Now, and it's going to be matame their clothes. Now, that's only that for these animals that you burn, which on Yom Kippur, the par and the seir, the bull and the goat, if you take them out and you burn them, you're going to have this tumah. But Shar Nisrafim Minayin, how do we know about the Parlim Davar Shel Tzibor and the Seirim of Yom Kippur of Avodah Zarah? There are other ones that you do the exact same thing with, and it doesn't say in the pasuk there that the one who burns them is going to have this tumah. So how do you know that they have the same tumah? Talmud Lamar Chatat Chatat Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda learns it from the extra word Chatat comes to teach you to other korbanot Chatat. Rabbi Meir Omer, he says that's very nice, but the truth is you don't really need that. It's much more intuitive from the pasuk itself. Harei Omer, vet par chatat, vet seir chatat. In other words, that is just coming to tell you it's the par of the chatat, the seir chatat. But she'ein Talmud Lamar, what's really a much better proof in that pasuk to what you're trying to say is he doesn't disagree with Rabbi Yehuda about what he says. He disagrees about how he learns it. She'ein Talmud Lamar lechaper. The word lechaper is totally not needed. Matamud lomar lechaper, and it's obviously, right, what does it say? The parochet and the siyur chatat asheruvat amam lechaper b'kodesh. We know it's lechaper b'kodesh. So now, why do you think it's telling you lechaper? That is a much more intuitive word that's telling you any other time you're getting atonement from one of these things, and then you're burning it outside, which would include all the other sacrifices. So that, anyone who's getting atonement from these sacrifices, and then you burn them in the Beit Hadeshen, that you're going to have this level of impurity. Now, if that's a more intuitive one, then why didn't Rabbi Yehuda learn it from there? And must be because for Rabbi Yehuda lechaper lo mashma. He doesn't learn lechaper my taima la mishum dimibayle legzera shava. He must need it for the gzera shava that Rabbi Shimon had, and therefore we're going to say he didn't have that. He must have learned the gzera shava there, and therefore he must hold like Rabbi Shimon. Okay, and from there we assume that it's that. Just one second. Right. And then we're going to assume that he uses the lechaper to teach you the gzera shava of Rabbi Shimon, lechaper, right? A parochet or shuvadaman lechaper, malalam b'shekiper. Right. Now, why specifically that one? Because the Rabbi Eliezer didn't use the gzera. In our pasuk, he used the lechaper b'kodesh, and it was gzera shava to a different word, lechaper b'kodesh. So this pasuk of the par and the seir weren't used. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, we're going to assume he didn't use this one because he needs this for the gzera shava back to our pasuk. And therefore, we're going to end here with Hadron alach kol Zevachim shenitarvu, finish our chapter. And now we explained that Rabbi Yehuda actually ends up with the most limited approach here. Has to be intentional, and it has to be also where you actually did kapara. Okay? And that's why he's going to have the most limited position there is. Okay, so we saw in this section, just to review, and then the next part, the end of class, we'll review just from the next chapter. So we went through the opinions of Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Yehuda. What's their proof? Right? Where do they get it from? Or at least with the first two, why don't they each hold by the other? And then with Rabbi Yehuda, we wanted to know which one of the previous does he hold by. Within his opinion, it's only mezid, only if it's intentional. Is it b'shekfar kiper or b'shalo kiper? We said in the end, it's where you already got atonement. And we did have that first end of the previous question, the line of questioning of Rava. Okay, now starting with our mission. New chapter. HaMizbeach mekadesh et ha'ra'oila. Okay, for this I also have a study guide. I'll start sharing my screen in a minute. The Mizbeach sanctifies what is ra'oi for the altar. What does this mean? So what it means is, and we've seen this many times already, things that go up on the altar, even if they're disqualified, generally, depending on the rules, and here we're going to talk about different opinions and different rules, there's two options of what we could do. Either we say, that's disqualified, get it off the altar, or we say, you know what? Once it got on the altar, the Mizbeach kind of accepts it. Okay, we're going to use different terms. Like here it says the Mizbeach mikadesh, it sanctifies it, even though it was disqualified, it kind of makes it okay again. And we also saw this term, we're going to see it again today. It becomes lachmosh al mizbeach. It becomes like the bread of the altar. Okay, so now we have this idea that the mizbeach sanctifies things that go on it, but hara'oilo, things that normally could go on the altar, and not things that don't belong there. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? Things that don't belong there. We're obviously not talking about if I stuck a chair on top. Okay, we're not talking about really don't belong. That obviously we're not talking about. But, right, because also we have to think something that was disqualified. So what kind of things were disqualified? We're going to have to see later what this is coming to exclude. And we're going to see different definitions of what is included in Ra'oilo. So Rabbi Yeshua Omer, we're going to have a machlok between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Gamliel right now. And then we're going to have a third position of Rabbi Shimon. And then we're going to have a braita with two other opinions that disagree with Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Gamliel. So I'm going to share my screen right now. And here's our study guide. Okay. So the Mishnah starts off with Rabbi Yeshua. After it gives that topic sentence, Rabbi Yeshua Omer, Kol ha'ro'oi le'ishim im ala lo yered. Anything that normally gets burned on the fire, that is meant to be burned, im ala lo yered, if it goes up, it doesn't come down. Shenemal, what's the proof text? Hi ha'olah mokdah. There's a pasuk in Vayikra chapter 6, verse 2. Tzavad Aaron bepanav. Okay, tell Aaron his sons, Zomar zot Torah Torah. This is the rules for the olah. Hi ha'olah mokdah. This is the one that goes up on the pyre. Okay, that's a fire. Okay, so ma'olah shiru yali shim. So just like korban olah is ra'oi shim, it goes on the fire. Im alta lo tered, and if it goes on, you don't take it down. Av koshu ra'oi shim im ala lo yered. So if you have anything else that's supposed to be burned on the altar, if it goes on, it doesn't come down. Comes Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel omer, kol ha'oil mizbeach im ala lo yered. Doesn't have to be ra'oi for the fire. It's just something that could be brought on the altar. We're going to see in a minute what this includes. That is not included in Rabbi Yeshua. Shene'emar, same pasuk, hi ha'olah mokdah al hamizbeach. Okay, what does that mean? It's on the altar. Anything that goes on the altar. He's focusing on that and not on the mokdah. Ma'olah shiruya lemizbeach l'malta lo tered. Av kol davar shiruya hu ra'oi lemizbeach l'malta lo tered. So anything that, right, just like an olah is supposed to, can go on the altar. And if you put it on, it doesn't have to come down. Anything else that's like that, if it goes up, doesn't have to come down. Okay, now, right, they learn this whole thing, and that's where we learned this halacha, that it's, right, first of all, why do they keep comparing it to the olah? Because that's what it says in the pasuk. These are the rules for the olah. And hiya olah mokdah, the second olah, means it goes up, and when it goes up, it doesn't come down, even if it's disqualified. So now they say the following. Now they tell us, they spell it out. Ein bein divrei Rabban Gamliel l'divrei Rabbi Yeshua ela hadam v'hanisachim. The two differences between them are the blood. Blood goes on the altar, but it doesn't get burnt. Nisachim, libations, go on the altar, but they don't get burnt because they get poured. Okay, so those things is the nafkamina between Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yeshua. So Rabban Gamliel omer lo yardu. Rabban Gamliel will say they don't come down. You don't have to take them off, and you shouldn't even. And Rabbi Yeshua says yardu. Rabbi Yeshua says you have to take them off. Okay, because he says only things are supposed to be burned by the fire. Okay, later in the Gemara, we're going to get to what does each one do with the other one's pasuk. Okay, but for now we're going to move to Rabbi Shimon because we're in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is done with the proof text. So we had, right, the Mishnah did three things. What's the difference? What's each one's opinion? Where did they get it from? And what's the nafkamina, the practical difference between them? Rabbi Shimon omer, hazevach kasher unisachim psulim. If we have a case where the korban is totally fine, but the libations are disqualified, or hanisachim kshirim, where the libations are fine, these are libations that go with the sacrifice. And the zevach is not kasher. Zevach is pasul. So then the libations could be good, but the meat, let's say, got disqualified or something. Afilu zev psulim, or the third case, both are psulim. So either one or the other is pasul, or both are psulim. Hazevach lo yerei, we're always going to leave the meat on. Hanisachim yerdu, this is his big chiddush. He says the libations get taken off no matter what. Even if they're the ones, right, if they go with the sacrifice is disqualified and they're not, they still have to be taken down. Why? So Rashi says, starting on the next, we're now on Amud Bet, and the Rashi here, even though it's on the previous page, the Rashi appears here at the top. She'em is bech mekadesh psulim ela be'im beglal atzman. He says, when we say the Mizbeach sanctifies things that get put on that are disqualified, they mean only things that come in their own right. These libations are an accessory to something. They come because of the korban. So they don't get to stay at all. And even if they're not disqualified, but the korban is, they can't stay on the altar. Now we're going to go back to the first line of the Mishnah. The first line of the Mishnah was Ra'oilo in. Okay, so it said, Amizbeach mekadesh et ha'ra'oilo. That was that first sentence. It's right here. The Mizbeach sanctifies anything that's worthy to go on the altar. So they're saying, well, that Ra'oilo, yes, but ain Ra'oilo lo. It sounds like things that are not Ra'oi to go on the altar would it. Lemiutemai, what is this excluding? It must be coming to exclude something. Amar Papa, lemiute kamatzin shalo kitshu b'kli. It's to basically say that a kometz, if you took a kometz, it's to exclude this case. I took a kmitza, okay, that's like a mincha offering, right? I took a handful of the meal offering, and I didn't put it in a sanctified vessel. Now that can't go on the altar. It has to be first put in a sanctified vessel, and then it can go on the altar. So he says that's coming to exclude that case because a kmitza, that the meal offering, that part of the meal offering that wasn't put in a sanctified vessel cannot be put on the altar. So that's a problem. So that is not going to be allowed to stay on the altar if I put it on, if it was disqualified. Matkif la ravina, or even if it wasn't disqualified, it just wasn't in a sanctified vessel yet, I have to take it off. So now they say, Ravina says, I don't understand. How is this different from what Ula says? To Amar Ula. Imurei kachim kalim she'elan lefnei zrikat damim lo yirdu. If you take the parts of the animal, they're supposed to be burned on the altar of kachim kalim, right? Because okay, so I don't know why specifically kachim kalim, but right, okay. So anyway, we take these imurim of kachim kalim that he'elan. You put them on the altar when also before you did something that was supposed to happen first. You can only put them on the altar once you sprinkle the blood. So if you did it before the zrikat dam, and then you put them on the altar, they're not right for the altar yet. And yet it says, Ula said, lo yirdu. It says you don't take these off. So now we have a problem because, right, okay, if we look at our chart, looking at the second chart on the page. So the second chart on the page says basically, so why are the komets has to come off and the imurim don't have to come off? They're basically the same thing. They're both things that shouldn't go on the altar. So theoretically, they should both be excluded according to what we said. So, and the reason why Ula says not is what I told you before we're going to get to. Na'asu lachmosh mizbeach. These become the bread of the altar. It kind of becomes like owned by the altar and they can stay on. So what's the difference between them? So this I put on the chart. Hanach lo michasru ma'aseh begufayu. The imurim are not missing any action that you haven't yet done to the imurim. The imurim are ready to go. What's the problem? You have to do the zrikat dam, which is something else. There's blood and there's parts of the body, right? The parts the fatty parts that go on the altar. The fatty parts, you're done with them. They're ready to go. But the blood isn't. Those are two different things. But hane, in the komets, you didn't do something to the komets. You were supposed to put that komets into a kli and you didn't, and then you put it on the altar. That's completely disqualified. Okay, now let's scroll up to the middle of the top chart. So now we're going to have a back and forth with Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Gamliel about what does each one do with the other one's pasuk. So Rabbi Yeshua Omer kol haroi lishim, ... That's just a quote from the Mishnah. So what did he say though? Let's just see. He said, it's only kol haroi lishim, fire, because it goes on the pyre, right? So what does Rabbi Gamliel do with that? Rabbi Gamliel nami aktiv ola mukda. So he says, hahula hadure pok in hudata. This is to tell you, sometimes when you put something on a fire and it starts burning, it's sometimes like things go flying out because because of the fire, it could start, like something causes it to move and it could fall off the altar. So what this is telling you is if something's on the fire, okay, there's rules about what kind of things, we'll get to that on Daf Pevav, but if things are on the fire and they fall off like a limb of an animal's body, you put it back on. And that's hi'olam mukdah, you bring it back up on the mokeh if it falls off. Okay, so that's what he does with that pasuk. Well, now we're going to have a ping pong, and we're going to ping pong back to Rabbi Yeshua and say, wait, idach, so the other one, Rabbi Yeshua, la durei pok in menale, where is he going to learn this halacha from? Nafkaleme, so where's he going to learn it? Next part of the chart. Asher tochala esh, okay, this is a different pasuk. Asher tochala esh, it's the next pasuk after hi'olam mukdah. It says the Kohen wears his clothes, and then it says, and he picks up the ashes from, this is what we call the Trumat Hadeshen. It's the action of removing the ashes from the altar. What ashes? Asher tochala esh, that the fire ate, consumed, right? I don't need you to tell me those are the ashes. Of course those are the ashes. What other ashes would there be? So he says, Asher tochala esh is the fire consumes something. It must be talking about something additional. If it fell off, the fire has to consume it. You have to put it back on. And that's where he gets the pok in from. Okay, v'idach, what is Rabban Gamliel? We're ping-ponging back. What does he do with that pasuk? Asher tochala esh. What does he need it for? It's to tell you that what do you return to the altar? Only things that come from an ola, okay, like meat, but not ktoret. If you have incense that started burning and then it flew off the altar, you don't put it back on. Okay, it's only, and that he gets from this pasuk because there's a little more to it. It says, Asher tochala eshet ha'ola lemizbeach. Because the fire consumed, what the fire consumes of the ola. It's only things that are like an ola, and it's not ketoret. So it's a detail within pokin he's going to learn from that pasuk, but not the actual law of pokin. That is going to learn from the other pasuk. Now, how do we know this is a halacha that we could say, oh, he derives it from here? Ditane Rabbi Chanina bar Menyumi Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. So Rabbi Chanina bar Menyumi said in the name of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Asher tochala eshet ha'ola lemizbeach, Ikulei olam atamachzir v'iyah tamachzir ikulei Torah. So we basically learned from this pasuk, and since we have a braita for this, we could say that must be what Rabban Gamliel does with that pasuk. Ve'idach. Okay, so where is Rabbi Yeshua going to learn that halacha from then? If that pasuk is used for him for the law of poking, not necessarily for the fact that it's only things that are like an ola, to which the Gemara says, what do you mean? Idach lav mimela shamat minadi kulei ola mahadrinan. In other words, you can, the pasuk is telling you, put back things that fell off, and it says ola in the pasuk, so it obviously means only things that are like an ola, and you could really learn both. Okay, obviously Rabban Gamliel thought you need to learn them from two different psukim, and that's why he goes his way. Okay, Rabban Gamliel Omer. Now what we're left with, what we didn't do, okay, you can see this chart is all filled in, but we didn't do everything in the chart yet, because what we didn't do now is, that whole section was all, what does Rabban Gamliel do with the pasuk of Rabbi Yeshua? Now we have to say, what does Rabbi Yeshua do with the pasuk of Rabban Gamliel? So remember, Rabban Gamliel said anything right for the Mizbeach, because it says, Hi ala mokda ala Mizbeach. Why does it say ala Mizbeach? Rabbi Yeshua nami aktiv Mizbeach. So what does he do with that? Hahume ba'ale, he needs it for the following. My time akama rachmana, kol ha'ro'oi lemokda. Kol ha'ro'oi lemokda, mekadesh Mizbeach. Okay, so he says, what's the reason? So I didn't read this so well. Let's just say it again. My time akama rachmana. In other words, what is the reason the Torah says this? It's, again, Hiolam Makda means anything ra'oi for fire, right? Can stay on the altar. What's the reason? Because kol ra'oi lemokda mekadesh mizbeach. In other words, the way he reads this pasuk is Hiolam Makda, because anything that goes on the mokda, ala mizbeach, the mizbeach sanctifies it. Okay, that's his proof. Okay, idach. So where does Rabban Gamliel see the reason for this? Mizbeach achrin aktiv. There's a different pasuk with Mizbeach, and in fact, that pasuk is a much better pasuk for this. Okay, we're going to read in Shmot. It's in Shmot chapter 29, verse 37. Kol hanogea b'mizbeach yikdash. That's where he's going to learn the reason from. So now we're on Rabban Gamliel here. It's going to say the reason why, if it goes on the altar, you don't have to take it down, is because the Mizbeach sanctifies it. Okay, so now, wouldn't you think Rabbi Yeshua would learn it from there, and not from the pasuk that, you know, Hiolam Mokda ala Mizbeach teaches you because it went on the Mizbeach sanctifies. This is a much better pasuk. So idach, and now in the end, you could say he does learn it from that second pasuk, but then you have two psukim teaching the same thing. Now we're going to say he needs two psukim. Why? There's two different kinds of things that go on the altar that are disqualified. One is it was never good to begin with, and one is it was actually good in the beginning, then got disqualified, and now, right, and now it's still disqualified. So that's called haytalashat kosher. There was a time when it could have been used. So the first pasuk is going to say, well, if it could have been used at first and now it can't, well, since it was kind of good at some point, we'll leave it. But you might not have thought that, what if it didn't have shat kosher? What if it was never good? So the second pasuk is coming to say, even if it was never valid, it still could go on. So now we're going to have to ping pong, and this will end our whole chart here and our whole ping pong between the two of them. Ida kevan de psulin ninhu v'rabinu rachmana. Now, look, this whole thing is weird to begin with. We're taking disqualified items, we're putting them on the altar, and we're saying again, you shouldn't put it on the altar, but if you did, it stays. You can leave it. Well, if that's the case, then the Torah is basically saying it's okay, even though it's disqualified. We're going to allow it to stay on. Well, then it shouldn't make a difference if it had a shat kosher or didn't have a shat kosher. What's the difference, right? Either which way, it's something disqualified. You can learn that all from one pasuk because they're both really, it's the same idea. Something that's disqualified. Who cares if at some point it was valid or it could have been used and now it couldn't, or it was never valid? It doesn't really matter. Okay, now we go to Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Hazevach Kasher. So Tanya, now we're going to have a braita. Okay, there's nothing on the sheet about this. I'm going to stop my screen for a minute. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Ma ola haba biglal atzma, av kol haba'im biglal atzman. So why did he say that it's only things that are come on their own? Because it's like an ola. Because remember, this whole thing is learned from the ola. Now the ola comes on its own right. It's its own korban. It doesn't come as an accessory to anything. So therefore, only things that are like an ola that come on their own. Yatsu nisachim haba'im bichlal zevach. So out of that, right, excluded from that is libations. Okay, comes Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Rabbi Yossi Aglili, now we're going to have, well, it seems like there's a continuation of the braita that we just started. Now in this braita, we're going to have, besides this Rabbi Yeshua, this explanation, we're now going to have two other opinions. Different, we're going to see, than the ones we saw before. So Rabbi Yossi Aglili, next chart on the page, what does he say? Now, it's not so clear what they mean at first, and we're going to explain it as we go on. Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer, mitoch shenemar kol hanogeh b'mizbeach yikdash, as we saw before, anyone who touches, right, anything that goes on the altar will be sanctified, meaning put disqualified things and leave them, right? If you put them, leave them. Shomeh ani bein ra'ui bein she'eno ra'ui. It sounds like anything really that goes on the mizbeach, whatever goes on the altar, right, will be sanctified. Talmud Lamal, that's why it says kvasim. Okay, this is the next pasuk. Right after kol hanogeh b'mizbeach yikdash, it says, V'zeh asher taseh lemizbeach. This is what should go on the altar, and then it starts, it's really a new topic, but since they're juxtaposed, we're going to learn from one to the other, which is put on the altar these two, the sheep, b'nei shana, shnayim liyom tamid, the korban tamid. So he says, Ma kvasim ru'uyim af kol ra'ui. Well, just like kvasim or ru'uyim can go on the altar, it only includes things that can go on the altar. The mizbeach is only going to sanctify something that theoretically could go. Obviously, it's disqualified, because otherwise there's no unique thing here, but theoretically the item could go on the altar. Rabbi Akiva Omer, he's going to learn the same idea, but from somewhere else, and then we're going to see what's the difference between them. Ola, okay, it says Ola, okay, in that pasuk about the kvasim. It says it in, it's a few pasukim later, in verse 42. We were in verse 48 with the kvasim. I'm sorry, 38, and now we're moving to 42. Ola tamid l'dorotechem. This is a korban Ola. Those kvasim are korban Ola. So he says it has to be like an ola. Ma'ola ru'uya, af kol ru'uya. So it's like an ola, and just like a korban ola, burnt offering is ru'uya for the altar. So likewise, this has to be something for the altar. Okay. Whether you learn from Kasim, whether you learn from ola, what's the difference? Well, that's the Gemara's question. My benai, what's the difference between them? Well, Amarav Adabar Ava, olata of psula ika benai. What if you have a bird offering? So, mar maitelami ola, umar maitelami kvasim. If you learn it from Ola, so it's a burnt offering, that would be included. If you learn it from Kvasim, it's only animals, not birds. So if you put a bird on, you'd have to take it off according to Rabbi Yossi. And if that's the most extreme position we've seen so far, the most limiting, only animals. Rabbi Akiva is even more limited, is a little less limiting, but still more limiting than all the ones in the Mishnah. Because he said, okay, animals and birds, but not, for example, mincha offerings, right? Whereas if we get to the next opinion, then you have Rabbi Yeshua who says even things that burn on the altar. So that could be animals, birds, minchas. Rabban Gamliel, animals, birds, minchas, libations, and blood. Okay? So you see the progression. So now we're going to do a little bit of a ping pong between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva, and then we're going to go and compare the people in the braita to the people in the Mishnah. Okay? In other words, Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva to Rabbi Yeshua, Rabban Gamliel, and Rabbi Shimon. And then tomorrow we'll continue with a whole bunch of other comparisons. So we're almost at the end here. We're going to compare, first of all, these two psukim. Iktiv kvasim, ulaman demaitelemi kvasim. If you learn it from kvasim, haktiv ola. What does Rabbi Yossi do with the ola? He says it's only animals, but ola should include also birds. Well, ikiv kvasim velo ktiv ola. If it just said animals and not ola, hava amina, I would have thought of filu mechayim, even if they're alive, meaning, okay, this is a weird one. If an animal, a live animal, which is not worthy for the altar right now, because we're talking about it's disqualified animal, runs up the ramp and gets to the top of the altar. Maybe you'd think, animal went up. You don't have to take it down. Therefore, Kata Brahmana Ola to say, no, we're only talking about animals that are being sacrificed. Okay? And only when they're dead, basically. Ulamanda Ola, Haktiv Kvasim. Now, what about Rabbi Akiva? What does he do with the word Kvasim? Iktiv Ola v'lo ktiv Kvasim, since he actually includes birds as well. Well, if it said Ola and it didn't say animals, Hava Amina, Afilu Mincha. Well, a Mincha also is Ola. It's a type of offering that gets burned on the altar. Therefore, Kachar Bachman Kvasim to say not meal offerings. It has to be they were live at some point. Okay? Now comes the question, Ma'ika ben Hane Tanai Lahane Tanai Demanitin. So, what's the difference between these two Tanaim and the braita, Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva, and the difference between them and the Tanaim and the Mishnah? So we're going to have Rav Papa and Rav Rish Lakish who answer this question. With that, we'll finish for today. Amar Rav Papa, Kamatzim shekitshu bekli ikabenayu. If you have a kometz that was sanctified in a vessel, that's the difference between them. Litana didan lo yirdu. So here, it's not the kometz we talked about before that wasn't sanctified. It was sanctified, but it's a mincha. So we already said, Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva don't think a mincha is going to be able to stay on. You're going to have to take it down. And Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Gamliel, and Rabbi Shimon all think a mincha. It's burned, right? It goes on the altar. It fits all the criteria. It comes on its own, a mincha offering. Obviously, we're talking about a mincha that comes on its own and not one that goes with a korban, because otherwise Rabbi Shimon wouldn't agree. Rish Lakish Amar, mincha haba b'fnei atzma, l'divrei kulan lo tered. Oh, sorry, right. L'divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili v'Rabbi Akiva tered. Okay, so now we have this mincha that comes on its own, and that's what we were talking about before. Okay, this is the same kind of idea. A mincha that comes on its own. So in this case, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon are all going to agree. Okay, one was the kovetz that came from the mincha, and the other is the mincha offering. Okay, so if the mincha was disqualified and goes up, lo tered. If Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva say that's a mincha, that doesn't get included. Okay, and those are two nafkaminas between the cases. Okay, let's do a quick review. What we really have in this whole thing are 5 different approaches. We have Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Gamliel versus Rabbi Yossi, Haglili, and Rabbi Akiva, each one, right? And then the Rabbi Shimon is that side, which just really has a point about anything that's an accessory is not. But we have things that go on the fire, right? We have things that are burned and things that can just go on the altar for other reasons, like libations and blood. And those are, right, so Rabban Gamliel is the most inclusive position that we're going to be able to leave. Rabbi Shua gets a little more limiting with the fire. Then we get to Rabbi Akiva, who says we're even more limiting because we're going to include, right, we're going to exclude minchas, but we will include birds. Rabbi Yosef Glue says we're not even going to include birds, only animals. Okay, and we saw everybody's proof text. We saw how they disagree with each other, and we had the ping pongs back and forth. And we saw this other thing, which was right at the beginning, about the exclusion of this word kol ha'ra'oilo. What's ha'ra'oilo? Come and say, what if you have comments that wasn't even in a sanctified vessel? And we compared that to imurim before zrikadam, which is a different problem. Those actually get to stay because there's not missing an action, whereas the comments is missing an action. With that, we finish for today, and we'll continue with a bunch of comparisons, not just between the Mishnah and the Braita, but between the different Tanaim and kind of categorize them into sets of things that some of them agree with and others don't agree with. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom and Shavuot Tov.